BBC's Voice of Football, John Motson, for an appraisal of old Big Ed, the manager, Brian Clough. But now let's hear from Eddie Mair about today's PM.
Hello. Gordon Brown is due to speak publicly for the first time about the Northern Rock crisis, a crisis which has eased during the day. The bank says most of its calls are now about people wanting to reinvest money. We'll talk live to the Shadow Chancellor. Also, a call for new rules governing police car chases. From Iraq, the debate about security guards and what they do. We'll report from Poland as the country prepares to vote. We'll talk again to a man we cut off yesterday. And someone's put Belgium up for sale. Join me if you can.
Thanks, Eddie. That's PM in half an hour. Now with Radio 4's biography series, Matthew Parris is joined by the BBC's Voice of Football, who himself chooses a legend of the game.
Hello. Today on Great Lives, an unmistakable voice. My guest must be recognisable by voice alone to millions, reporting some of our era's most nail-biting sporting moments. Last year, John Motson made broadcasting history to become the first British commentator to cover 6 consecutive World Cup finals. John, welcome. You've been commentating on football for over 36 years. You're renowned for your encyclopedic knowledge of the game. When did your passion for this particular sport begin?
I was taught to my father, really, the Reverend William Motson. He was in the Methodist Church. In my early days, from about the time I was 6 or 7, he took me all over London to different games, not always to the same ground, I have to say, and that developed my interest. And like any other schoolboy at the time, I had my scrapbooks and collected programmes and became a passionate football supporter from then on.
Where did you decide to be a commentator?
I think when I left school, I really wanted to be a written journalist, and I went into local newspapers and then provincial newspapers, and I think what changed my life really was when I was on the Morning Telegraph at Sheffield in the late 60s, and the BBC brought in the first raft of local radio stations. Sheffield was among them, and without any warning or without any training, one or two of us who were working for the morning paper were sort of hijacked into the radio studio and told to do a report there, and somehow or other my voice seemed to fit, and within a few months I was lucky enough to get a job in the old Radio 2.
And your choice of a great life today?
It has to be Brian Clough. Of all the managers I've met over the 30-something years I've been doing this job, and there have been many, I don't think anyone has ever been as riveting or as compelling as a character, as well as a manager. When he passed away, I said to somebody, they've thrown the mould away now. There'll never be another Brian Clough.
Now, look, I'm going to have to be honest. I am the last person in the world qualified to assess or even cross-examine a witness to the greatness of a football legend. I've never been a fan. I feel a bit like the proverbial rabbi conducting a guided tour of a pork pie factory today, so you're going to have to take command, John.
Okay.
Your mental shelves of football memorabilia must be crowded with prize exhibits. What is it about this one, Persuade Us, that elbows its way to the front?
Well, I think when I started on television, managers were just becoming household names. They'd been very much low profile prior to the 70s, but television, of course, brought these guys onto our screens. The Don Revis, the Bill Shankleys, the Ron Greenwoods, the Alf Ramseys, if you like, although he hated doing interviews. Out of all that whole range of people who suddenly became personalities in their own right, as well as in their own dressing room, Brian Clough stood out from the day I first met him. I mean, I remember as a very nervous radio reporter standing in the press room at Crystal Palace and having to keep him waiting. This was when he was at Derby. Had to keep him waiting for 10 minutes while the programme got round to the point where he was going to be interviewed by me. And I was scared stiff that he would walk out or something like that.
Was that your first interview?
That was my first meeting with him. And I was amazed how he was the one calming me down, so to speak. Don't worry, lad, just relax. I always remember saying that to me, you know. And from then on, whenever I met him, the thing about Brian Clough was, though, one of the reasons I'm privileged to do this show, is that you never knew which Brian Clough was going to turn up next, because he could be the most kind and overbearingly friendly man in the world, but he could also give you a real rough edge of his tongue if he felt like it, and I saw both sides of him. But that, in a way, is what made him the character he was, because if you talk to people who played for him, like Martin O'Neill, they'll say exactly the same, that he would come into the dressing room one day when you thought you'd play well, and he would, you know, give you a real going over, and another time you might be 2-0 down at half-time, and he'd say, "Same again, gentlemen, please," and they'd win the game 3-2. I mean, he was unpredictable. That's the word I'm really looking for.
Have you counted? Can you count? Have you kept an archive of all the interviews you've done with him?
Do you know something? He is the only person of whom I've kept interviews on, well, the old VHS videotape, if you like, as it is probably DVDs now. Yes, I've kept 4 Brian Clough interviews that I did, all quite lengthy ones, all for special features for Sports Night or programmes like that, and I haven't kept any other interview that I've ever done with a football person.
What strikes me about him is how mercurial he was, so fiendishly difficult to pin down. I've been trying to put together a few words to describe him. A genuine original, you could say. He challenged the established order of football. He was a man with a tragic flaw. He was triumphant but star-crossed, a genius of a manager with an inspirational touch, a loudmouth, big-headed, big-hearted bully, super-ego, egomaniac who drank his way through his problems. Is he any or all of those things to you?
He's all of those things, and you could add another page or two, really. I mean, there really isn't enough time to do Brian Clough justice. He was all those things. I knew him, obviously, in his early days at Derby, when he was fit and fresh and in his 30s, and he used to come in like a whirlwind, and you'd think you really were in the presence of somebody special, even then. And, of course, I saw him at the end of his managerial career, when, sadly, his health had declined to the point where he just wasn't up to the job anymore, if the truth is told. And of course Nottingham Forest sadly were relegated in his last season, but you know, I saw him throughout that 25-year span, and it was as I said, it was a privilege.
Just remind ourselves of his notoriously vivid, sometimes abrasive eloquence.
Oh, you are a bloody disgrace! Hey Baz, for missing the target from there, you want bloody shooting!
I never used to think of egos, but obviously I had one. The egos never came in there, I just thought I was right.
I think all managers insist on honesty. I don't think I'm different to anybody else there. What I'm not afraid to do is I'm not afraid to tell people when I don't see honesty. God gave us grass for many reasons. Cows eat it, people walk on it, cricket's played on it, and football should be played on it. If God wanted football played in the clouds, for example, he'd have built a pitch up there. We play football the way I think it should be played.
Brian Clough. Old Big Ed, which is what he said the letters of his OBE stood for. Maybe the best manager the England team never had. Or, John Motson, should that be the best stand-up comedian we never had, the best master of the one-liner?
Well, he was certainly that, and he should have been the England manager, really, on merit. Without going over old ground, the Football Association were afraid to take the risk with Brian. They thought his outspoken nature would be an embarrassment to them, and they played safe and appointed Ron Greenwood. But in terms of motivating a team, which I think is what the England manager's job is primarily about, because everybody knows who the best players are, it's a question of getting the best out of them. I think he would have done that.
Same as in politics, though. If you're direct, if you say exactly what you mean, it's both a help and a hindrance in some ways. He was born in 1935. He died of stomach cancer in 2004. He was loved by the public for his, let's say, forthright manner. He transformed the fortunes of what were once considered two parochial clubs between which there was an intense rivalry. But he changed all that, didn't he?
Yes, I mean, when he went to Derby, they were a run-of-the-mill second division team, and he and Peter Taylor put them back on their feet and got them into the first division, won the championship in 1972. It was my first season at Match of the Day, and that was when I first got to know Brian Clough. And then, of course, after the slightly unfortunate episodes at Brighton and Leeds, he finished up at Nottingham Forest in 1975 and virtually did the same thing there, although in their case, of course, he took them on to 2 European Cups. I mean, to envisage that happening now, it's just, I mean, as every year goes by, the achievement gets more and more magnified, and rightly so.
Also here to give us a glimpse into Clough's success, his failures, his fallouts, is Duncan Hamilton, now deputy editor of the Yorkshire Post, but during the 70s and 80s, a football reporter on the Nottingham Evening Post, throughout Clough's 18-year reign at Notts Forest. Duncan, your biography of the man, Provided You Don't Kiss Me, I must say is a fantastic read, even for someone like me that isn't interested in football. Why did you call it Provided You Don't Kiss Me? I know the answer. Tell the rest of us.
Well, I think when you're covering a football club, and I'd been covering Nottingham Forest even by then for about 6 or 7 years, you become part of the football club family. But I think that anybody who is kind of part of a large family knows that family rows tend to be worse than the kind of rows that you actually might have with your friends. I'd written a match report. I thought to myself when I wrote it, I wonder whether he'll actually like this, because I made 1 or 2 scathing type comments. And I thought, I wonder what reception I'm going to get after the game finishes. And I didn't have to wait very long, really, because as the very second the whistle went, I could see one of the young players coming up towards the press box, and I got those fatal words that said, I think the boss would like to see you down in the dressing room. And I'd never been there before after a game. And I went down, and I knew exactly what was coming. The players were still getting changed, and the showers were on, and the steam was coming out. And he literally came out of the showers like some kind of vampire from Hammer horror films. And his face was scarlet. And he said to me, I didn't have to motivate our team, because they'd actually won this game. I said, I only had to show them what you'd actually written on Monday. And at that point, he turned over to the wall, and he'd cut out the match report, and he'd pinned it onto the dressing room wall. And so I was absolutely horrified, and all the players looking around at me thinking, God, what's he going to do next? And he went on, and I thought, this is never, ever going to end. And then finally he finished by saying, right, that's it. Your relationship with this club is now at a total end. I want you to leave. So I walked out, thinking that that was the last time I would actually ever see him. And I remember having to walk back to the office that night, thinking to myself, well, I don't know how I'm going to get round this. Anyway, I'm sitting at my desk on the Friday lunchtime, when I should really be down with him, probably sharing a nice scotch. And suddenly the phone rings. And he picks up the phone. He says, why aren't you here? And I said, well, you actually banned me on Wednesday night. He said, oh, it was only a short thing. I mean, I didn't mean that you actually shouldn't come back. He said, why don't you come down now? He said, we'll just open some champagne, open some scotch. I've got 1 or 2 lines that you can give me. Now, the previous Saturday, I'd seen him kiss someone on the cheek, and he was a fairly kind of elderly chap. He did have this habit of kissing people. And I just paused for a second and said, I'll come down, provided you don't kiss me. And he was about to slam down the phone, but before he did, he said, well, you're far too ugly for that. Then he slammed down the phone.
I find that story fascinating, John, because I can think of 1 or 2 great leaders of whom the same sort of stories can be told. The shouting, the rudeness, followed then by a kiss and make up. Do you think he did this consciously, playing soft cop and hard cop?
I can't tell as good a stories as Duncan does in his book, because he was with him every day, but it happened to me in the foyer of Highbury once. I'd done a commentary, not on one of Brian Clough's teams at all. It was Arsenal versus Tottenham at White Hart Lane, in the very early days of George Graham at Arsenal. And I'd praised Arsenal to the hilt. I sensed they had a team ethic that was going to take them, and it did, as it turned out. They beat Tottenham that day. Anyway, Clough had listened to this commentary and decided that I was biased. So as he walked into Highbury on the night Forest were playing there, I was standing with my back to the wall as he came through the front door, and a bit like Duncan's story, I knew what was going to happen. He had the jabbing forefinger out straight away. Disgrace, your commentary. I pay my licence fee for people to be unbiased. And I'm standing there and there's, by now, all the people in the foyer standing as spectators in this, and I can't get a word out, you know. And he marched off to the dressing room, using a word which I wouldn't repeat on Radio 4, and slammed the door. And I never saw him. And at the end of the game, of course, I got the producer saying, we've got to get an interview with Brian Clough. So I thought, well, what's going to happen now? Because he just lambasted me. And I'm walking round the pitch, we used to do the interviews by the dugout then, and he's standing there waiting for me. And he's got a cup in his hand. So, and when I'm still about 30 yards away, he shouts out, are you cold, John? So, and it had been a bit windy so I was shivering a bit. So I said, yes, Brian, get this down, yeah. And before we started the interview, I had to drink half a tumbler full of scotch. And that's how he was, you know. Horrible to me before the game, couldn't have been nicer afterward.
Do you think there was an element of calculation there?
Oh, Duncan, do you think he did it deliberately?
Well, I think that basically, people say to me, how did you manage to build the kind of relationship that you did with him? And I think he was the sort of person that you had to go through phases with, because when I first covered Forest, I was working for one of the local agencies, and used to sit outside his office, maybe for about 3 or 4 kind of hours, and he would walk past you 5 or 6 times, and he wouldn't even acknowledge the fact you were there. And so I decided that if I were there for 6 or 7 hours, at some point he would have to come out, and he would either have to say to me, move, or he would have to say to me, I've got this particular line for you, now will you move? And so we went through this trial of strength and patience. And I suppose at the end he realised that I wasn't going to go anywhere.
This is BBC Radio 4. I'm Matthew Parris. You're listening to Great Lives, and our Great Life this week, chosen by John Motson, is Brian Clough. With us too is his biographer, Duncan Hamilton. Clough was born in Middlesbrough in 1935, Duncan, the sixth of 9 children. His father sometimes worked for nearby ICI and in a sweet factory. But I gather that it was his mother, Sally, that he was particularly close to, and that it was her that was fanatical about football.
Yes, it was, and he never stopped talking about his mother. I didn't know him until after his mother had died. But even as late as the mid-80s, I remember being in Holland, and J.B. Priestley had just died. And we were picking up the papers a day late, and we went out for an early morning walk, and he said, "Is there anything in the paper?" I said, "Oh, J.B. Priestley's died, and he's past 90. And he said, "Oh, what a good age." And we then started to talk about family, and he said that he could still hear his mother's voice. He wasn't necessarily a believer in the afterlife, but he said to me that it would be wonderful that if there was an afterlife, then he could be there with his parents, because I think everything that happened to him, with the exception of the alcohol, came from his parents and from the way that he was actually brought up in a very solid, traditional way.
Slightly unsuspected side of his character, John. I mean, he doesn't strike you as a mother's boy in any sense of the word.
He did used to stress the values of family life, though, and if you saw the way he brought up his sons, I mean, I only know Nigel, really, but, I mean, there was a lot of the values and standards that Brian Clough stood for that you can see in Nigel, and the way Nigel's bringing up his kids as well, by the way, which I've noticed. No, he was very strong on family values, Brian. He used to say to young players, "How's your mam?" It's always like the mother was always an important figure in the family, definitely.
He failed his 11+. He left school at 15 to become an office clerk. And football seemed to be his future, but initially as a player rather than a manager. Am I right?
Oh, well, not only are you right, I mean, his playing record as a goal scorer was phenomenal. I mean, it was 200 and something goals in 200 and something senior games. I mean, it was as good as anybody's, probably better than Jimmy Greaves. But, I mean, I think what we have to say here is that Brian Clough's career ended with a horrific injury on a frozen pitch at Christmas when he was playing against Bury and collided with the goalkeeper. That effectively ended his playing career at, what was it, 27, Duncan, was he?
Well, he became manager at 29, so yes,
Yeah.
It would have been, because he had 2-year gap.
I think there was a feeling that the disappointment of having to end his playing career so early had a lot to do with how Brian Clough's life went from then on. I think his determination to prove himself as a manager came partly out of that shattering disappointment.
Yeah, rechanneling.
And there were even people that felt his reliance on alcohol had something to do with the way he tried to get over the initial shock of that injury.
I think there were 2 pivotal moments in his life, really. The first one was obviously the injury, but the second one was Leeds. I didn't know him before Leeds, but knowing the way that he spoke incessantly about Leeds in terms of how they were doing, how they might have done had he actually been there, I think that changed him profoundly, because he'd actually failed. I mean, he'd failed kind of twice, because he'd walked out of Derby when he shouldn't have done. Yeah. He'd gone to Brighton when he shouldn't have gone. Then he'd taken on Leeds, a club which he'd criticised for years and years, and the players certainly didn't want him. And I'd just like to ask John whether or not he found any difference between the Brian Clough that he knew before Leeds and the Brian Clough when he first came to Nottingham Forest.
A little bit. I think he was a bit chastened by the time he got to Forest. I think the Leeds thing did wound him. I think you're right about that, Duncan. I think, though, when Forest got on the march again and he got Peter Taylor back with him, then the old Cloughie resurfaced. And he was just as abrasive and as kind of compelling as he had been at Derby. But there was that hiatus, I agree with you, as he moved through that particular experience.
It's fair to say we can't really talk about Brian Clough without discussing his long-term collaboration with Peter Taylor, his right-hand man, a thread that runs throughout the whole of his life. Here he is reflecting on how 2 is better than 1.
Football management is a very lonely job on occasions. No matter how many people you're surrounded with, i.e. journalists, i.e. sycophants, i.e. coaching staff, i.e. you name it, fans who adore you and everything, there are times when you sit down and unless you've got a right-hand man, as I had with Peter Taylor, it is a lonely job and you're on your own.
Duncan, how do you characterise that relationship? Give us an overview of it.
Well, to see them together, they were almost of the same bone and blood and breath, really, and to get them together was a bit like watching a mixture of the Cray twins and Morecambe and Wise, really. And they used to play off each other, and one could begin a sentence and the other one would finish it. One could be good cop, one could be bad cop. But I think one of Peter's particular strengths was, I mean, he was a scientist of football, and he wasn't a great player. He was a goalkeeper. But very early on, he took an absolute fascination in the tactics of the game.
And it was Taylor who spotted Clough, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Clough was about the third or fourth choice sometimes centre-forward at Middlesbrough. And, of course, he didn't go down terribly well because there were things that he said which got back to other players. And it was only Taylor, really, who kept on championing him and kept on telling him that he was an excellent player. And that's how the friendship began. Peter was slightly older than Brian. He was a family man and had his own house. Brian was still living at home with his parents, and so he used to take Peter's house as a kind of refuge, really. And they used to go off not only to watch football matches. This sounds kind of rather daft, but John will know exactly what I mean. Footballers don't always want to go and watch football, but those two were always watching football. Peter, at that particular point, was very far left in political terms, and so he was taking him to Labour Party meetings. And so this friendship developed. Brian always said Peter was the person who could always tell him that he was wrong, and he wouldn't resent it. Now, I don't necessarily believe that. I think he always told him when he was wrong, but I think Brian resented it at times.
But knew he needed it.
Absolutely, yes.
It sounds almost like a marriage.
Well, yes, it was, and I got to know Taylor quite well simply because Brian was sometimes too busy to talk to you, and I would ring Peter on a Friday and get some information about the team from him, and it was interesting, as Duncan said, the way the two interacted. When Brian left Brighton to go to Leeds, Taylor stayed on at Brighton as manager, and that was the first time I experienced a little bit of a rift between them, because like all relationships, they had their moments. And Peter told me once how he resented the fact that Brian earned so much more than he did. And then there was another moment when Peter said to me one night in the hotel before a League Cup final, "Do you think I should write a book?" And I said, well, if you write a book, I said, you're going to have to call it With Clough by Taylor, because that's how you're sort of seen. And they did, the publishers actually used that title, and Clough apparently got very angry that Taylor had made money out of a book which effectively was about Brian Clough. So there was all that used to go on, but they were, I think he summed it up brilliantly. I mean, they were a double act. I had some memorable times with them, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so enthusiastic about talking about him, because it just gripped you, the whole presence of the guy, you know.
It ended very bitterly, the relationship with Taylor.
I think Duncan's the best one on that, because this was something to do with John Robertson, was it?
It was. John Robertson had been looking for an extended deal at Forest, and he'd been trying to speak to Brian for several weeks, and Brian kept putting him off. On Cup Final Saturday, the news broke that Peter Taylor had signed John for Derby, and Brian made an enormous song and dance out of the fact that he didn't know. It became a breach between them that was never healed. They never spoke. It was an incredibly sad end.
He'd married his childhood sweetheart, Barbara, who'd lived a few doors away from him in Middlesbrough. She must have had a lot to put up with, John.
I saw Barbara Clough very recently, actually. They played a match at Derby pre-season against Forest for the Brian Clough Trophy, and Barbara came as guest of honour, and we had a chat in the boardroom, and she always kept herself very much in the background, though. I mean, all the time I knew Brian Clough, I think I only met his wife twice. Both times she was just walking down a corridor, very low profile, very low key. But as you say, that relationship was very much the backbone of his life. And I mean, what she had to put up with, in the nicest sense of the word, on the one hand, but also, of course, with his decline health-wise, must have been pretty shattering. But she was a very, again, Duncan may have known her better than me, she seemed to me to be a very uncomplaining type who wanted to stay in the background.
She's an absolutely wonderful woman from the experience that I had meeting her. And I don't honestly think that without her, during the very difficult period that he had in, say, 1983, after Peter went and he was trying to rebuild Nottingham Forest, that he would have carried on. I think that at least he always knew that he could go home and he could close the doors. And he used to always say, because as football managers are, if they're playing from Saturday to Saturday, if they lose on the Saturday, they're not much fun to be with on the Saturday night. And Barbara was the one who used to say, after you close that door, I don't want to hear anything about the game. I don't want to hear any moans or groans. I think she just kept his feet on the ground.
You're both quite right that she wanted to stay in the background. In fact, she never made any public pronouncement on him except once at his funeral in 2004 when she read this poem.
What made him so endearing is elusive to explain. This tyrant in a sweatshirt, barking orders in the rain. Today he'd offer vitriol, tomorrow marzipan. A paradox a puzzle, but a diamond of a man. When the gods apportioned modesty, one youngster wasn't there. He was in the Q-mark Confidence, receiving twice his share. With 2 good feet beneath him, he considered it enough, and so was born the character we know as Brian Clough.
Barbara Clough. He was always a professed socialist who publicly supported the miners during the miners' strike, and yet, personally, he was obsessed by money. Is there a paradox in that, do you think, John?
Well, I think there is. I mean, I never quite got a hold of what all that was about. I mean, he talked about being an MP at one point in his life. Yes, he did side with those he felt were being underprivileged and slightly put down. But yes, I have to say, he was financially motivated in many, many ways, Duncan, wasn't he?
It is. I think that came back to his childhood. I think it was a very poor childhood. Middlesbrough in the 40s and 50s, just like post-war Britain generally,
yes, austerity,
was incredibly difficult to live in. And I think he had a slight fear of not wanting to go back to that ever. And yet, the other element of him was that he gave away money incredibly generously. He certainly gave of his time, but the amount of money that he must have given to various charities without any coverage at all because he didn't want it. Again, it just shows what a kind of complex Chinese box of a man that he actually was.
He became, throughout the 70s, a byword in the press, popularised by Mike Yarwood's impressions of him, a byword for blunt outspokenness. He was, in a way, as unpackaged and unspun as the decade itself. How would he fare in the much more PR-wise, marketing-wise years that we live in now, do you think, John? Could you be so blunt?
Well, it's interesting. People think about Bill Shankly and say, could he manage now, because agents would send him crazy, and they would Cloughy too, really, to be when they first came on the scene. I can't imagine Brian Clough being any different. That's the point. I mean, he would try and survive in the way that the only way he knew. And I know what you're saying, because his bluntness was so politically incorrect, if you see what I mean. I don't quite know now whether he would be savaged by lawsuits after some of the things he was prepared to come out and say, because we're living in a completely different time. I think what he did do, though, I think he was the first football manager to go on to things like Parkinson, Frost.
It was almost the only name I knew.
I mean, it seems incredible now, but people used to seriously ask him what his views were on things like Watergate or the Vietnam War. And he used to come out with great long tracts about this, which is obviously why, at some point, the Labour Party thought, why don't we make him a candidate?
John Motson, you're known as being a stickler for detail, using as many as 6 different coloured pens in your card index system to refer to during the heat of a match. What killer facts in your different coloured pens would we find in your entry for Brian Clough?
Well, obviously, the things that stand out are the fact that he led an unfashionable club to 2 European Cups. Unheard of today, that would be. The fact that he rebuilt 2 teams that were down on their luck in not a particularly thriving part of the country at the time, in terms of glamour or in terms of financial backing. But I think most of all, I just think his wonderful personality, the way he could command a room, the way he could talk to you in such a direct manner that you were just almost transfixed listening to him. I'll tell you what I think I'd write down. When I went to do my first interview with Brian Clough, I said to my editor, what sort of things do you want me to get him to say? And the editor looked at me and he said, listen, he said, if Brian Clough read the telephone directory, people would still listen.
John Motson and Duncan Hamilton, thank you both for sharing thoughts about and experiences of a giant of a football manager, Brian Clough. Duncan's book, I should add, Provided You Don't Kiss Me, 20 Years with Brian Clough, is published by Fourth Estate. Goodbye.
Great Lives was presented by Matthew Parris, and the producer in Bristol was Mark Smalley. In a moment we'll be joining Eddie Mair for a look at the day's events in PM, but first a look ahead to a programme which reveals how bullying, the #1 worry for school-aged children, is changing and taking on new forms. Alongside the traditional physical bullying is the rise of cyberbullying, where bullies use the internet and mobile phones. In a new series on BBC Radio 4, Penny Marshall looks at its rise and meets young people who've become victims of cyberbullying, which afflicts the always-on generation, online that is. In the first programme, we meet one 15-year-old victim.
Well, when I went onto the page, there was like more and more, because you had like hits on it, and every time someone viewed the page you got an extra hit, and there was like thousands and thousands of hits on the page.
How did that make you feel?
I just felt awful. I just felt like there was no escape.
Bullying.com begins next Monday morning at 11 and continues on Tuesday and Wednesday mornings. On 92 to 95 FM, 198 longwave and digital radio. This is BBC Radio 4.
It's 5 o'clock. This is PM. I'm Eddie Mayer. The Prime Minister